She expected forgiveness for her just emotional affair after 5 years of marriage. I thought we had the kind of relationship that could weather any storm, the kind where two people tackle problems together instead of running to other people for comfort. I was completely wrong about that. I'm Marcus, 29, and I've been a financial planner here in Tampa for the past 6 years. Built my practice from nothing, starting with friends and family referrals until I had enough clients to rent a proper office downtown. My wife Vanessa and I met through mutual friends at a gallery opening, and what started as casual conversation about her yoga studio dreams turned into late-night planning sessions over coffee. She was ambitious, driven, had this infectious energy about building something meaningful. We married after dating for 2 years, and for the first 3 years of marriage, everything felt solid. We supported each other's goals, celebrated each other's wins, worked through the inevitable bumps that come with building careers simultaneously. Vanessa opened her yoga studio 18 months ago, pouring everything into creating this serene space where she could teach the mindfulness practices that genuinely helped her manage stress. I watched her transform from someone who talked about teaching yoga someday into someone who had 15 regular students and was expanding into weekend workshops. The studio became her sanctuary, and I respected how much it meant to her. That's why the Orlando opportunity created such an unexpected rift between us. My firm offered me the chance to invest in and manage a new branch office there, which represented everything I'd been working toward: partnership track, significant equity stake, the kind of career move that happens maybe once in a lifetime. I brought it up over dinner one Tuesday, expecting Vanessa to share my excitement about this next chapter. Instead, she set down her fork and looked at me like I'd suggested we move to Antarctica. "You want to leave Tampa? Leave everything we've built here?" Her voice had this edge I rarely heard. I explained the opportunity carefully, the investment potential, the leadership experience, how it could secure our financial future. But Vanessa kept circling back to her studio, her students, the community she'd spent 2 years cultivating. "I can't just abandon my practice, Marcus. These people depend on me. I've finally created something that matters." The conversation that night stayed civil, but I could feel something shifting. Over the next 2 weeks, every discussion about Orlando turned into an argument about priorities. Vanessa accused me of caring more about money than her dreams. I countered that I was thinking about our long-term security, that we could always start fresh somewhere new. "Easy for you to say," she snapped during one particularly heated exchange. "You can take your client relationships anywhere. I've built something physical here, something real." The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when I showed her the financial projections again, trying to demonstrate how the Orlando move could benefit both of us long-term. Vanessa stared at the spreadsheet for maybe 10 seconds before sweeping my laptop off the coffee table onto the hardwood floor. "I'm not a number on one of your charts, Marcus. I'm your wife. Sometimes that should matter more than your precious calculations." I knelt down to check if my computer was broken, more stunned than angry. In 5 years together, Vanessa had never done anything remotely violent. When I looked up, she was crying, but her tears felt more like frustration than sadness. "I need some space to think," I told her, closing the laptop without checking for damage. "This conversation isn't going anywhere productive right now." I packed a weekend bag and drove to my brother's beach house in Clearwater, figuring a few days apart would give us both perspective. We'd had disagreements before, but nothing we couldn't work through with some time and honest conversation. I spent the weekend walking the beach, calling my brother for advice, and thinking about compromise solutions. Maybe I could negotiate for partial remote work, or delay the Orlando move for 6 months while Vanessa transitioned her studio. I even researched yoga instructor opportunities in Orlando, thinking perhaps she could see this as expanding her practice rather than abandoning it. By Sunday night, I was ready to come home and have a real conversation about making this work for both of us. I drove back Monday evening expecting to find Vanessa in her usual spot on the couch, probably reading one of her mindfulness books or planning studio classes. Instead, she was pacing the living room like she'd been waiting for hours, her energy completely different from the anger I'd left behind. "We need to talk," she said before I could even set down my keys. "Right now." I sat down, thinking this was progress, Maybe she'd used the time to consider compromise solutions too. But the words that came out of her mouth weren't about Orlando or the studio or finding middle ground. I went to a meditation retreat this weekend, she began, which seemed like a healthy way to process stress. There was this spiritual healer there, someone visiting from California who specializes in chakra alignment and energy work. I nodded, waiting for her to connect this to our situation. Vanessa took a shaky breath. I slept with him. The words hit me like ice water. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. You what? It wasn't planned, she said quickly, sitting across from me but avoiding eye contact. I was in such a dark place after our fight, feeling so disconnected from you, from myself. During the evening meditation session, he guided me through some energy work, and I felt this incredible spiritual awakening. Like he could see parts of my soul you'd never understood. I opened my mouth to respond, but she wasn't finished. It was purely chakra-based, Marcus. Not physical in the way you're thinking. It was about healing the spiritual wounds your materialism has created in our relationship. He helped me realize how your obsession with the Orlando opportunity was blocking my root chakra and preventing authentic connection. I sat there processing what she just told me. My wife had sex with another man and was describing it like a therapeutic breakthrough. Chakra-based, I repeated slowly. You're calling adultery energy work. Don't use that ugly word, Vanessa said, finally looking at me directly. What happened was a spiritual awakening. I've been feeling so disconnected from my authentic self because of all this financial pressure you've been putting on us. He helped me understand that I needed to explore other connections to remember who I really am. The clinical way she was explaining betrayal was almost worse than the betrayal itself. Vanessa, you had sex with another man. I don't care what spiritual terminology you use to describe it. You're being so linear about this, she said, her voice taking on that patient tone she used with difficult yoga students. This is about cosmic compatibility, about understanding that our souls might be on different vibrational frequencies right now. I'm trying to be honest with you about my spiritual journey. I felt something cold and final settling in my chest. Is he married? The question just came out, but Vanessa's pause before answering told me everything. I don't know, she said, but her eyes flickered away. We didn't discuss mundane details like that. Our connection transcended conventional relationship structures. That pause, the way she avoided the question, made it clear she knew exactly what his situation was and didn't want to tell me. Right? I said, standing up. So you had a spiritual awakening with someone else's husband while I was gone trying to figure out how to make our marriage work. This is exactly what I mean, Vanessa said, her voice rising. You're reducing something beautiful and healing into this crude, possessive framework. A truly evolved partner would understand that I needed this experience to remember my divine feminine energy. I looked at my wife, this person I'd thought I knew completely, and realized I was staring at a stranger. I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want a straight answer. Is this man married? Vanessa's composure cracked slightly. His marital status isn't relevant to the spiritual work we did together. That was all the answer I needed. I walked to our bedroom and started pulling clothes from my dresser. What are you doing? Vanessa followed me, sounding genuinely confused. I'm packing, I said, grabbing my toiletries from the bathroom. Where are you going? We need to process this together. Maybe find a couples shaman who can help us work through this spiritual crisis. I turned to look at her one more time. There's no crisis to work through, Vanessa. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. I finished packing while Vanessa sat on our bed in lotus position, apparently meditating through what she kept calling our spiritual emergency. When I told her I was filing for divorce, the meditation stopped abruptly. Divorce? She looked genuinely shocked, like the possibility had never occurred to her. Marcus, we just need to find the right energy healer to help us process this together. There are couples who work specifically with sacred sexuality and spiritual awakening. I kept folding shirts into my suitcase. I'm not processing anything. I'm done. What followed was 6 hours of the most exhausting emotional manipulation I'd ever experienced. Vanessa cycled through every approach in her spiritual playbook, starting with more meditation poses while explaining how divorce would create karmic debt for both our souls. When that didn't work, she switched to desperate bargaining, offering to close the studio, move to Orlando immediately, even convert to whatever spiritual practice I wanted if I'd just embrace this growth opportunity she'd given our marriage. "I'll call him right now and tell him our connection was just temporary," she said around hour 3, pulling out her phone. "I'll explain that you're my true twin flame and we were just working through a karmic lesson." The fact that she had his number saved in her phone told me this spiritual awakening had been more planned than she'd admitted. By evening, when none of her spiritual explanations had convinced me to stay, Vanessa shifted to pure rage. "You're destroying our sacred union over one moment of spiritual exploration during a crisis," she screamed, throwing meditation cushions across the room. "Do you know how many women would appreciate a husband who seeks higher consciousness? You're spiritually bankrupt, Marcus. You don't deserve someone who's evolved enough to transcend conventional relationship boundaries." I finished packing and called my brother to let him know I'd be staying at his beach house indefinitely. "This is temporary insanity," Vanessa said as I loaded my car. "When you calm down and stop being so ego-driven, you'll realize I was trying to save our marriage by exploring what was missing." I drove back to Clearwater that night and called a divorce attorney first thing Tuesday morning. The lawyer, a straightforward woman named Patricia who'd handled plenty of these cases, listened to my story without judgment. "Spiritual affairs are becoming more common," she said matter-of-factly. "The language changes, but the impact on the marriage is the same. Let's talk about asset division and timeline." I thought I'd have a few days of peace to process everything, but Wednesday afternoon I heard cars pulling into the gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched Vanessa's parents get out of their Prius, followed by a thin man with a gray ponytail I recognized as David, her meditation teacher and studio mentor. They marched to the front door like some kind of spiritual intervention team. "Marcus," Vanessa's father said when I opened the door, "we need to discuss what you're doing to our daughter." Behind him, Vanessa's mother was clutching sage bundles and what looked like healing crystals. David stood silently, radiating what I assumed was supposed to be calming energy but mostly just felt awkward. "I'm divorcing her," I said simply. "That's what I'm doing." She made one mistake during a spiritual crisis, her mother chimed in, waving the sage around. "One moment of seeking healing energy when you abandoned her in her hour of need. The divine feminine requires exploration and growth." Her father stepped closer, trying to look intimidating despite being about 5'6" and wearing hemp sandals. "You left for 4 days without warning, leaving her emotionally vulnerable. Maybe if you'd been supporting her spiritual journey instead of forcing materialistic goals on her, none of this would have happened." "Actually," I said, "she had sex with a married man and called it chakra alignment. That's what happened." David finally spoke up in this whispery voice that was supposed to sound wise. "Brother, your attachment to conventional relationship structures is blocking your heart chakra. Vanessa experienced a beautiful awakening that could deepen your connection if you'd open yourself to growth." I looked at this collection of people standing on my brother's porch, all of them genuinely believing that adultery was a spiritual practice I should embrace. "You're right," I said. "This has definitely opened me to growth. I've grown enough to recognize that I deserve a wife who doesn't sleep with other men when we disagree about career decisions." Vanessa's mother started chanting something about protecting divine feminine energy. Her father made some comment about aligning my chakras personally if I didn't stop hurting their daughter. David offered to guide me through a meditation that would help me release toxic masculine possessiveness. I closed the door and called Patricia to ask if there were restraining order options for spiritual harassment. 2 months into divorce proceedings, I discovered that Vanessa had been conducting a full-scale public relations campaign to rewrite our entire story. The first sign came when I stopped at my usual coffee shop downtown and the barista, someone I'd chatted with regularly for years, gave me the coldest shoulder I'd ever experienced. "Heard about you and Vanessa," she said while making my latte with obvious disapproval. "Pretty harsh, divorcing someone for following their spiritual path." I was still processing that comment when a guy from Vanessa's yoga studio approached my table. "You're Marcus, right? Vanessa's soon-to-be ex." He had that earnest look of someone about to deliver a lecture. I just want you to know that the entire wellness community is supporting her through this difficult time. What you're putting her through for choosing personal growth over your controlling nature is really toxic, man. That's when I realized what had happened. Vanessa hadn't told anyone the actual story. In her version, I was divorcing her simply for exploring spirituality and seeking personal development. No mention of adultery, no mention of the married spiritual healer, no mention of her calling me her safety net while sleeping with someone else. Just a controlling husband who couldn't handle his wife's spiritual evolution. Over the next 2 weeks, I got ambushed by yoga students and neighborhood friends who'd heard only Vanessa's carefully curated narrative. A woman cornered me at the grocery store to tell me I was spiritually toxic and emotionally unavailable. Another guy from our old Friday night trivia group said he'd lost respect for me because Vanessa deserves someone who supports her journey. I started carrying around screenshots of Vanessa's confession texts, not that I planned to show them to random people, but just to remind myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The breaking point came when 3 potential clients canceled consultations after discovering David's blog post about supporting divine feminine energy against patriarchal control. He'd written this elaborate piece about unnamed clients whose partners couldn't handle their spiritual awakening, painting Vanessa as a victim of masculine oppression who'd been punished for seeking authentic connection. The post gained serious traction in Tampa's wellness community, getting shared hundreds of times with comments about toxic masculinity and spiritual abuse. My firm's managing partner called me into his office Friday afternoon. "Marcus, I'm not sure what's happening in your personal life, but some clients are asking questions about your character. There's this blog post circulating that seems to be about you." I explained the actual situation, that my wife had committed adultery, reframed it as spiritual growth, and was now playing victim when I filed for divorce. He listened carefully, then suggested I consider accepting the Orlando transfer immediately to escape the local drama. "This kind of reputation damage can take years to recover from in a market this size," he said. "Fresh start might be your best option." Meanwhile, Vanessa's yoga instructor had launched a social media campaign with hashtags like #DivineFeminineSupport and #SpiritualFreedom. She posted photos of Vanessa looking devastated and broken, with captions about how hard it was to watch someone be punished for spiritual exploration. The comments were filled with women sharing their own stories of partners who couldn't handle their growth, creating this echo chamber where Vanessa was the poster child for spiritual oppression. I decided it was time to start telling the truth. Not in some dramatic social media blast, but quietly, to people who mattered. When my neighbor asked why I was never home anymore, I told him the real story. When clients inquired about the blog post, I explained that my wife had committed adultery and was using spiritual language to avoid accountability. When mutual friends pressed for details, I was specific. Vanessa didn't just explore spirituality. She slept with a married man as retaliation for a business disagreement, then expected praise because she reframed it as chakra work. The response was immediate and telling. People who heard the complete story had very different reactions than those who'd only heard Vanessa's version. My neighbor, a divorced father of 2, shook his head and said, "That's not spiritual growth, man. That's just cheating with extra steps." One of my longtime clients, after hearing the truth, said, "I wondered why that blog post felt so one-sided. Nobody gets divorced over their spouse taking yoga classes." But David wasn't finished with his campaign. His follow-up blog post, titled "Honoring Women's Spiritual Journeys Through Difficult Transitions," went even further in portraying me as spiritually bankrupt. He wrote about how some people are so disconnected from higher consciousness that they can't recognize divine feminine energy when it appears in their lives. The post didn't name me directly, but anyone who knew us could connect the dots. It got picked up by several wellness blogs and shared across Facebook groups devoted to spiritual awakening and conscious relationships. Reading it felt like watching someone describe a completely different situation while claiming to talk about my life. But the truth was spreading too, in quieter circles. The yoga community might have bought Vanessa's story, but the business community, my clients, and our longtime friends were getting the real version. And once people understood that spiritual exploration actually meant adultery with a married man, their sympathy for Vanessa evaporated pretty quickly. The divorce turned ugly when Vanessa's attorney claimed she deserved complete ownership of the yoga studio since she'd built the client base from nothing. Never mind that I'd provided the $30,000 startup capital, managed all the financial records, handled tax filings, and negotiated the lease agreement. According to her legal team, Vanessa's sweat equity trumped my financial investment because creative and spiritual contributions can't be quantified in monetary terms. Her attorney presented declining membership numbers as evidence that Vanessa was too emotionally devastated by my spiritual violence to maintain proper studio operations. What they didn't mention was that I discovered Vanessa had been deliberately alienating students to tank the business valuation before our court hearing. My attorney found emails where she'd canceled popular classes, doubled prices on workshops, and created drama with longtime members over minor policy violations. She was essentially sabotaging her own business to reduce what I could claim in the asset division. Your client is committing financial fraud, Patricia told Vanessa's lawyer during mediation. She's deliberately destroying business value to manipulate court proceedings. But Vanessa's team claimed this was just the natural result of spiritual trauma and my toxic masculine energy disrupting her ability to teach effectively. They demanded I cover the lost studio revenue as part of emotional damages. The harassment escalated when Vanessa's parents hired a private investigator to follow me around Tampa. For 3 weeks, this guy shadowed me to work, to the gym, to grocery stores, apparently hoping to document infidelity or financial misconduct that could support their daughter's case. All he recorded was me living like a normal single person, working late, taking solitary beach walks, meeting with my attorney, having dinner with my brother. No secret affairs, no hidden assets, no dramatic lifestyle changes that would suggest I'd been planning this divorce longer than I claimed. The PI's report was so boring that Vanessa's attorney submitted it as evidence of my emotionally detached and calculating personality, arguing that someone who adjusted so quickly to divorce must have been mentally checked out of the marriage long before the separation. Apparently, healing and moving forward was being used against me as proof of psychological damage I'd supposedly inflicted on my wife. Things got more ridiculous when Vanessa demanded I pay for her spiritual counseling sessions and temporary housing costs. She'd moved into this expensive wellness retreat center that charged $800 a week for what was essentially a luxury hotel with meditation gardens. Her argument was that my spiritual violence had triggered her need for intensive healing, and therefore I should cover the therapeutic expenses required to repair the damage. She's claiming that divorcing her for adultery constitutes abuse, Patricia explained after reviewing their latest demands. They want you to fund her recovery from the trauma of facing consequences for her own actions. But Patricia had been doing her own investigation. She'd hired a private detective who discovered that Vanessa's one-time spiritual awakening wasn't quite so isolated. The married healer from California had been a regular presence at Tampa area retreats for the past 8 months, always staying in the same expensive hotels, always conducting private sessions with select female participants. His wife had apparently filed for divorce 2 months earlier, citing multiple affairs with workshop attendees. More damaging to Vanessa's credibility was evidence of her ongoing relationship with this guy. Phone records showed daily contact, including late-night calls that lasted hours. Credit card statements revealed expensive dinners at romantic restaurants during times when Vanessa claimed to be too spiritually shattered to maintain normal activities. Hotel receipts placed them together at a beachfront resort just 3 weeks after our separation, when she was supposed to be in intensive healing therapy. Your wife isn't devastated, Patricia told me while reviewing the evidence. She's in a relationship with a serial cheater who targets married women at spiritual events. This isn't about consciousness or chakras. It's about a predator who found a vulnerable mark. The court hearing for asset division was scheduled for a Thursday in November. The judge, a practical woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen every variation of divorce drama, listened to Vanessa's claims about spiritual trauma and toxic masculinity with obvious skepticism. When Vanessa's attorney argued that the yoga studio represented her life's work and spiritual calling, The judge asked pointed questions about the declining business performance and mysterious client departures. Mrs. Thompson, are you claiming that your emotional state has prevented you from fulfilling your professional obligations to your students? The judge asked. Vanessa started explaining about blocked chakras and disrupted energy flow, but the judge cut her off. I'm asking about business operations, not spiritual concepts. Have you been able to meet your contractual obligations to your clients since the separation? The answer was clearly no, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The judge ordered the studio liquidated with proceeds divided equally, plus compensation to me for the documented startup capital. Vanessa burst into tears, not the gentle spiritual tears she'd perfected for social media, but angry, frustrated sobs of someone who'd realized her manipulation hadn't worked. Her entire spiritual circle attended the hearing, whispering about cosmic injustice and patriarchal court systems, but legal reality doesn't bend to wishful thinking about divine feminine energy. 4 months into the legal proceedings, I was leaving my office building after a late client meeting when I found Vanessa waiting by my car in the parking garage. She looked different, calmer, less performative, wearing regular clothes instead of the flowing fabrics and crystal jewelry that had become her uniform. I need to talk to you, she said quietly. Just 5 minutes before our final hearing next week. I almost kept walking, but something in her voice sounded genuinely different from the spiritual deflection and cosmic blame-shifting I'd grown used to. 5 minutes, I said, unlocking my car but not getting in. I've been in therapy, she began, and I noticed she said therapy, not spiritual counseling or energy work. Real therapy, with a licensed psychologist who doesn't let me hide behind metaphysical language when I'm avoiding responsibility. She took a shaky breath. I need you to know that I understand what I really did to us. For the first time in months, Vanessa looked me directly in the eyes without that practiced spiritual serenity. I weaponized the affair to punish you for making me feel financially dependent and powerless about the Orlando decision. When you presented those projections and talked about our future like it was already decided, I felt like I had no voice in my own life. So I found the most hurtful way possible to reclaim control. I listened, curious despite myself about this sudden shift toward actual self-awareness. The spiritual language was just cover, she continued. A way to make betrayal sound like enlightenment so I wouldn't have to face what I'd actually done. My therapist helped me see that I've done this before. Used affairs to punish partners when I felt powerless, then reframed it as personal growth or relationship evolution. That explained some things about her past relationships that had never quite made sense to me. Dr. Rodriguez made me trace the pattern back to my previous long-term relationships. Every time things got serious enough that I felt trapped or financially dependent, I'd find someone else and convince myself it was about spiritual connection or finding my authentic self. Then I'd blame my partner for not being evolved enough to understand. She was crying now, but they seemed like genuine tears rather than the strategic emotional displays I'd become accustomed to. I never thought there would be real consequences because my spiritual community always validated whatever I did as divine feminine expression. David and my yoga friends made me believe that conventional relationship boundaries were just patriarchal control, and that you'd eventually embrace the same perspective and forgive me as part of our journey. I found myself feeling something unexpected, not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of sad recognition of how thoroughly she'd deluded herself. I destroyed our marriage because I was terrified the Orlando move would expose that I couldn't maintain this spiritual guru image without my established Tampa support network. The studio, the workshops, the whole mindfulness teacher persona, it was all performance, Marcus. I was afraid that starting over somewhere new would reveal that I'm just someone who reads self-help books and repeats meditation cliches. The admission was more honest than anything she'd said during our entire relationship dissolution. When you showed me those financial projections and talked about partnership opportunities, all I could think about was losing the identity I'd spent 2 years building. So instead of talking to you about my fears, I found the most destructive way possible to avoid the conversation. I leaned against my car, processing this unexpected display of actual insight. Your therapist helped you figure all this out? She doesn't let me get away with spiritual bypassing, Vanessa said. Every time I tried to explain my behavior using consciousness or energy work, she'd ask me to translate it into concrete actions and emotions. Turns out, most of my spiritual revelations were just elaborate ways to avoid accountability. We stood there in the parking garage silence for a moment before she asked the question I'd been expecting. Is there any possibility of reconciliation? Any chance we could start over now that I actually understand what I did? I looked at this woman I'd been married to for 5 years, seeing her clearly for maybe the first time. The question isn't whether I can forgive what you did, Vanessa. The question is whether we can ever really be compatible partners. She waited for me to explain. You just told me that when you feel powerless or trapped in a relationship, your instinct is to seek external validation through betrayal rather than work with your partner on solutions. That's not a one-time mistake. That's a pattern you've repeated across multiple relationships. I could see her processing this, understanding that insight alone doesn't automatically rebuild trust. Even if you've identified the pattern, even if you're committed to changing it, I can't build a stable life on the hope that you won't repeat it during our next major disagreement. Every time we faced a difficult decision, I'd be wondering if you were already looking for your next spiritual awakening. The tears came harder then, and this time they felt like grief rather than manipulation. I know, she whispered. I know I can't ask you to take that risk. I just needed you to understand that what I did wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me being too afraid to be honest about my own limitations. The divorce was finalized on a humid Thursday afternoon in December, with only Vanessa's mother present for support. Her father and David had apparently distanced themselves after learning the complete truth about the affair, including the married healer's pattern of targeting women at spiritual events. The spiritual community that had rallied around Vanessa's victim narrative had quietly dispersed once the real story came out. Even her closest yoga instructor friends stopped posting supportive messages when they discovered she'd been deliberately sabotaging her own studio to manipulate court proceedings. Vanessa had closed the studio at a significant financial loss, liquidating equipment and breaking lease early rather than wait for the court-ordered sale. She'd accepted a corporate wellness position with a health insurance company in Austin, essentially abandoning the spiritual entrepreneur identity she'd cultivated for years. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was fleeing Tampa for a fresh start in exactly the way she'd accused me of trying to force on her. During our final mandatory meeting to exchange remaining belongings and sign paperwork, Vanessa handed me a sealed envelope. Don't read this until after I've moved to Austin, she said quietly. It's not a manipulation or a last-ditch effort to change your mind. It's just something I needed you to have. I put the letter in my glove compartment and didn't think about it for weeks. The Orlando transfer went through smoother than expected, with my firm fast-tracking the partnership timeline as a retention incentive. I used my portion of our asset division to purchase a waterfront condo with an incredible view of Lake Eola, then invested the remaining funds in index funds and municipal bonds, the kind of boring, stable investments that build real wealth over time. For the first time since my early 20s, I was living completely within my means with substantial money left over each month. I read Vanessa's letter on a Saturday morning in February, sitting on my new balcony with coffee and the newspaper. It was 3 pages of handwritten apology, more honest and specific than anything she'd said during our marriage. She acknowledged that she'd destroyed our relationship because she was terrified the Orlando move would expose her inability to maintain her spiritual guru image without her established Tampa support network. The yoga teaching, the workshops, the mindfulness coaching, it had all been performance designed to create an identity that felt more important than her actual personality. I knew that starting over in a new city would reveal that I'm just someone who took a few meditation classes and read books about consciousness, she wrote. The thought of being ordinary again, of having to build real skills instead of relying on spiritual jargon, was so terrifying that I sabotaged everything rather than face it honestly. She explained that the married healer had represented everything she'd convinced herself she needed: validation that she was special, confirmation that conventional relationship rules didn't apply to spiritually advanced people like her, and most importantly, an excuse to avoid the hard work of actual partnership. I turned our marriage into a power struggle instead of a collaboration because I was too immature to admit that I was scared of the changes we were facing together. The letter ended with something I hadn't expected: genuine accountability without spiritual language or cosmic explanations. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for another chance. I just needed you to know that losing you wasn't some divine plan or karmic lesson. It was the predictable result of my own choices, and I take full responsibility for destroying something real and valuable. 8 months after our divorce was finalized, my brother mentioned running into someone who'd known Vanessa in Austin. Apparently, her affair partner had been married with children and had disappeared completely when his wife discovered the relationship, leaving Vanessa emotionally devastated and spiritually disillusioned in a new city where nobody knew her backstory. She'd lasted 6 months at the corporate wellness job before being laid off during budget cuts, and was now working at a regular gym teaching basic fitness classes while living in a studio apartment and driving a used Honda. The woman who'd once proclaimed herself a spiritual teacher guiding others toward enlightenment was now struggling with the same mundane challenges as everyone else: paying bills, finding work, building genuine relationships without a manufactured identity to hide behind. I felt a mixture of sadness and relief hearing about her struggles. Sadness because watching someone's entire constructed reality collapse is never pleasant, even when they've caused significant damage. Relief because it confirmed that I'd made the right choice walking away when I did. Meanwhile, my life in Orlando was exceeding every expectation I'd had about the move. The branch office was performing better than projected, my client base had tripled, and I'd been offered equity partnership ahead of schedule. More importantly, I'd started dating Rachel, a fellow financial advisor who shared my straightforward communication style and practical approach to problem solving. Our first serious conversation happened over dinner when she asked directly about my divorce, and I told her the complete story without euphemisms or spiritual language. "So your ex-wife cheated, called it personal growth, and expected you to be grateful for the learning experience?" Rachel summarized with characteristic bluntness. "That's not spirituality. That's just selfishness with better marketing." Dating someone who dealt with reality the same way I did was revelatory. When we disagreed about something, we talked through it until we found compromise or accepted that we had different perspectives. When we faced decisions about our relationship's future, we made them together based on practical considerations and genuine compatibility. There were no hidden meanings to decode, no spiritual bypassing to navigate, no elaborate justifications for basic human behavior. 6 months into our relationship, Rachel and I were planning a weekend trip to Key West when she brought up something that had been on her mind. "You know what I realized about your ex-wife's story?" she said while we looked at hotel options. "She didn't just lose your marriage. She lost her entire identity, her support system, her business, and her sense of purpose all at once. That's not karma or cosmic justice. That's the comprehensive destruction that happens when someone builds their entire life on manipulation and performance instead of authentic relationships and real skills." I looked at Rachel, this woman who could analyze human behavior as clearly as she analyzed market trends, and realized I was experiencing something I'd never had with Vanessa: actual partnership between equals who respected each other enough to be honest about everything, including uncomfortable truths. Vanessa had been right about one thing. Losing our marriage had been a spiritual awakening. Just not in the way she'd intended.